ready? You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. So, my name is Craig Silverman. I'm the editor of BuzzFeed Canada. I'm going to help moderate this session. We have 4 speakers here. And the topic today is iconic images on social media, and in particular one iconic image, the image of Aylan Kurdi, who was a young Syrian boy, and the photo of his body on a Turkish beach went around the world in September of last year and created a lot of discussion and in some cases impact around how refugees were viewed, and in fact how some countries were dealing with refugees. And so we're going to talk about a report that was produced analyzing this image and some of the impact around it. We have 3 people who wrote parts of that report, and we also have an expert talking about the refugee issue as a whole. Just quickly from me, one of the reasons that I'm here is I wrote about the report when it came out for BuzzFeed. But also, there's a Canadian connection to the story of that boy and his family. When that image came out and started spreading on Twitter, it was talked about in Canada, but then it actually became a huge issue in the country when it was revealed that he had relatives in Canada and that the family eventually hoped to come there. And this happened at a time when our election was going on in Canada, and the current government at the time came under fire because they said they would not increase the amount of refugees that Canada would take in. The party that had started the election in first place and was expected to win said that they would want to take in more refugees. And the party that started the election in third place, the Liberal Party, their leader, Justin Trudeau, came out and said he would welcome 25,000 refugees by the end of the year. And the refugee issue was not a part of the Canadian election until that image and until that connection to the country came. And Justin Trudeau ended up winning that election. 25,000 refugees have come to Canada. The government has said it will take 10,000 more. And so that connection of the image and the family's relationship with Canada actually drastically changed how my country addressed the issue. And so that's one example of the impact that can be had. And so now I'll pass along to Francesco to talk about, to Farida? Okay, and we'll talk about the image itself, the different versions of it that spread, and to get some context around, the way that people reacted on social media. We'll have the slides up if you can.
Slides, please. Yeah, so we ended up writing this report, and I just want to give you a little bit of context. So I'm the director of the Visual Social Media Lab. Francesco is involved in the Visual Social Media Lab as well, as is Simon Faulkner. And we have some copies of the introduction to the report here as well. So when we saw this image, and we purposefully didn't include the image in the report, so this is how BuzzFeed showed the image. So a number of different approaches were already immediately visible in terms of different news agencies deciding to show the image with a warning or not, to not show it. Bild in Germany had basically black images. But what we decided to do is we decided not to show it, but what we were really interested in showing is the way in which there had been a response, in this case on Twitter. And so this is a visualization that Francesco made, and he showed it to me, and he said, there's something really happening here. The way in which people are not simply talking about this image, but the way in which people are talking about how these people on the move should be named, right? So what you see here is the flip from people being described as migrants, which essentially has very negative connotations, to refugees. And where you see a huge spike is around the time of the image of Aylan Kurdi. And so we thought there really is something happening here. We ought to do something. And then fast forward to mid-December when we produced this rapid response report, which I should say, as an academic, this is a very unusual way for academia to respond, rapidly and in this way, to try and shape and contribute in this way to the debate and to something that is unfolding and trying to understand what is happening, why was there this large response. So we responded as the Visual Social Media Lab, but we also joined forces with people like Claire from Tau Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia, but also with Simon Rodgers at Google, to try and understand, essentially, from this kind of big data perspective, what is happening with this image at the level of Google search. How are people searching for this boy, for this story on Google, to how can you interpret this image from a historical perspective, right? So from maybe an art historical perspective in terms of its iconography, why was there such a big response to this image? And so what we saw with the Google searches is that people started searching for this child before they started searching and sharing the image on Twitter. So when the news broke, people started searching for Syrian boy, drowned toddler, Syrian child, and so on, before the child became named. And what is interesting, and this is again in relation to the Google search data, and this is a quote from Simon Rodgers, is that last year, September, saw the highest ever global search volume for the topic of refugees in Google search history. So what you see here is not only was this a big story in terms of Twitter, right, which can sometimes function as an echo chamber where maybe it's big on Twitter, but maybe it's not big outside of that, but also within the wider news ecology and also in terms of Google search. This was a huge, huge story, and everybody wanted to try and understand what was going on here, as did politicians. So Craig has already alluded to the Canadian election, but elections across different parts of the world. So also, for example, in Norway, there was an election happening and the image played a really big part, but also different politicians were making big statements about what this image was doing, about what they were going to do in terms of the refugee crisis. And so what you had in the UK, where I am based, is you had a number of people saying, we'll open our homes to refugees, or this is a light bulb moment, and so on. So there was a kind of a tension between what politicians, unsurprisingly, what politicians said they were going to do and what they actually did. And in the UK, what they actually did is they started to push through a really aggressive immigration bill, quite quickly after this image. Now, in terms of the way in which artists responded, and this was, again, a story that was shared on BuzzFeed early on, but also on Board Panda, all the different ways in which artists had responded to this image. And so what you saw very quickly is that people felt the need to give their own interpretation to what they thought was happening with this image, which is really, I think, again, a very unique way of thinking about this image, both in terms of trying to place this child back into a domestic setting, right, hoping for a better outcome, so kind of this desire to see him as asleep, which of course he wasn't, versus laying the blame at the feet of the Arab world or European leaders. So there's this kind of big political response, or this very deeply personal, domestic, he is like my child, or he is like a child that I know. And if you think about photojournalism, one of the ways in which, and again, this is part of the report, we also looked at why did people respond and why did people recognize this image in this way, is, and this is in the part where the art historians are writing about, how can you interpret this from a small data, deep historical perspective, is because it's like many big images that we are very familiar with. And the kind of classic motif here is the Pietà. Another thing that became really clear is what do you do when you have image circulating on a platform like Twitter, where you also have a response that forces you to think about a visual culture outside of, our Western perspective. What do you do with an image, or what do you do with a visual motif when all of a sudden the child is placed into the arms of Saddam Hussein, and Saddam here is not seen as the evildoer. In Arabic, this essentially says, if I was still alive, this would not have happened to you, right? So this is a completely different perspective. Saddam is seen here as the savior, the potential savior of Aylan. And so what is also really important is that these responses have come from all over the place, right? So this is really, I think, also interesting to kind of break with your assumptions about how people are responding or the visual culture that you're part of. Another part of the report, and this is something that Claire will talk a lot more about, is kind of the decision-making in terms of the ethics of showing. Was it right to show this image? And if people didn't show it, why didn't they show it? And including in that is the ethics of counting. How are refugees counted? How does big data play a role in this? How are we counting the importance of a single child over a million of unknown children and people. So another part, and this is not dealt with in the report, is of course this image has a very long afterlife. And so one of the things that for us we kind of started to pick up on in the conclusion is to also think about Aylan Kurdi, who is the lone survivor in this family, who is, of course, constantly looking and being confronted with this image of his dead son. So one of the things that's, of course, very problematic about this image is that it comes to stand in for so many other dead children, but it is still somebody's son who died. And so what I think is very poignant about this is not only the kind of to remember that this is somebody's child, but also the role of the mobile phone and the way in which this device gives people such easy access to all of these images, including the father of this dead child. And then fast forward to Charlie Hebdo taking this up in January this year in the aftermath of the Cologne attacks in Germany, where they're essentially suggesting if Aylan had lived, if Aylan had grown up, he would have been one of the attackers in Cologne. He would have basically grown up into someone who would perpetrate sexual assault. To February this year, Ai Weiwei deciding, as part of a kind of art installation, to place himself as Aylan on the beach. So you get this, further life of the image and different responses. Now, the mobile phone is an interesting one because, of course, what this reminds us of is that refugees or people on the move, of course, have access to this technology, and this is actually really, really crucial technology, but it can also be used against them. So what you see days after the image of Aylan Kurdi went viral is you see this image on Getty, which was picked up by a lot of mainstream media, essentially saying they are undeserving because they are frivolously taking pictures with selfie sticks, and this really was used and picked up quite a lot in the UK. So you have this kind of tension around who has access to taking images and what can be shown. And then this really comes full circle with one of the selfies that someone took with Angela Merkel just days after the Aylan Kurdi image, who then fast forward to March 2006, is by the internet identified or suggested as one of the attackers in Brussels. So for us in the lab, what makes these images really complex and very interesting, but also a battleground, is that you have these different ways of interpretation, the different ways in which people are mobilizing and using these images, which I think makes images of the refugee crisis incredibly important, but also, there's all of these issues as well in terms of, some of these complexities. But Fran is now going to tell you how the image moved on Twitter in the first few hours after it went online.
Do you mind passing me that cable down there? Thank you. Just to avoid that we go black in the middle of the presentation. Yeah, so hi, I'm Francesco. I'm Italian, but I'm going to speak English so that we can all have a conversation, apart from my mom, who doesn't have headphones for translation, so she's not going to be able to listen in. But so what I've done for this bit of the study was tracking how this conversation started, how it spread, and how specifically the images traveled online. And the first thing we did was starting to build some context to what happened, because obviously these images are not part of an individual act, they are part of a longer discourse that has been brewing and has been growing and continued after the death of Aylan Kurdi. So I actually stole this idea on a thread on Facebook where I saw someone commenting on those pictures and saying, actually it's easy now because everybody's starting to talk about refugees, but until like few hours ago, everybody talked about migrants. And migrants obviously have an economical reason to move to a new country, and therefore the attitudes towards them is more kind of like picky, kind of like, you don't need to be here. Whereas a refugee is someone that is fleeing for his life, so it's someone that you need to welcome. So what I thought is, I thought like, let's put this theory to the test. And actually what we saw is that there was an increase of conversations about refugees that coincided exactly with when the pictures were released. I was then asked at another conference to check whether that kind of like trend continued, and actually, yes, it did continue. So after September the 2nd, where you have the massive spike and you have double as much people discussing refugees rather than migrants, then the trend continues, and with the Paris attacks in January, that trend towards the conversation being about refugees increases like tenfold. So you have a situation where like 6 months later and almost 1 year later now, the conversation about refugees is more than double the conversation about migrants. So the agenda is definitely changed, and the events have obviously contributed to changing that agenda, but it's interesting to see this kind of like shift at a macro level. And what we did then was to look at the specific moments where the shift happens, which is the moment where those conversations started to appear around the images of Aylan Kurdi. So what I'm going to do with these few slides is to show how we got to build the story that we then told in the report, and how you actually build kind of like a narrative around how this kind of like idea spread. And in doing that, I'm going to tackle one of the main questions which I've seen in this conference, which is that are relevant for the journalist community, which is how do you put relevant content in front of relevant people at the right time, which is the equation that you need to get right if you want content to go viral. It's like when you have these three things aligned, right content, right people, right time, then that piece of content is going to go viral, which is exactly what happened here. And we're going to go through a few of the kind of like ways that this happened. So the first thing you might want to look at is like, what channels did this conversation start from? So how did the story spread across multiple online channels? What we're comparing here is basically Twitter versus the news. And as you can see, on the first day, tweets are basically kind of like launching this conversation and driving it. And news is picking up towards the end of the day. And then from the second day, then the third day, news are kind of like catching up, and the live conversation on tweets is kind of like diminishing. And you can see it in the first hours of the first day how Twitter is basically dominating this conversation, and the news are kind of like slightly ramping up. The second thing that we looked at is how can you isolate the images, because obviously there's a lot of content. There's content that contains links, content that contains just text, and content that contains images. So what you need to do is to sample this data by image so that you can isolate the content, the tweets that carry an image. And then once you do that, what you can do is to start comparing, for example, how much conversation is carrying just text and how much is carrying images. And what's interesting is that the images in this case were simply driving that conversation. It was the fuel that was getting people to talk about it and to react to it. The next thing that's interesting to map is where is this happening? So if you start doing some basic geo-analysis to look at like where this conversation coming from, and you were looking at the entire data set, what you could see is that the UK and the US are dominating. But if you start slicing this by time, for example, if you look at the first hours, the majority of conversation is coming from Turkey and from Greece. If you look at the second hours, it's starting to spread to a few different countries, specifically Spain, Lebanon, and Syria. And in the first 3 hours, you start to get a much better picture of where this image is going, but it's still pretty much dominated by Turkey. So then you apply another layer to this data to try and understand what is happening here. Why is this content spreading in these different countries and not in other countries? So you start doing something like an influence analysis of the authors that have been posting this content, and you look at influence in terms of impact of this content and of the people that are posting it, in terms of how many reactions are they generating, how much reach do they have, how much visibility are they generating through the content that they're posting. And then you start kind of like getting a nice kind of like plot of what kind of people were responsible for the most engaging content for every single hour in the first 12 hours. And the first thing that you notice is that at the beginning of the day is mostly kind of like an activist type of audience that is driving this conversation. And towards the end of the day, the mainstream media kicks in. But you can see also that there's Elizabeth's slide from the Washington Post bureau in Beirut, in Lebanon, that actually had a massive kind of like role in put the kind of like content on the agenda. But you can start to see how different types of influencers are spreading this conversation at different times of the day. So the next thing that you can do is to try and bring the kind of like influencer information and the location information together in a network map to show actually how this content, how these ideas are traveling from one person to the other. So this is what a map looks like for the first hour, where you're simply looking at two main clusters, one in Turkey and the second one that appears slightly later on from Spain, that are starting to spread the message. Each name is an author that is posting this content, and you can see how this content travels from node to node. 2 hours in, you have a completely different landscape where the main actor is not anymore the kind of like Turkish journalist and activist that broke the story at 9 a.m. on Twitter, but he's Peter Buchert from Switzerland, which is at the center of this network, and he's connected with a huge humanitarian network that is obviously exposing the story to a bunch of people that simply didn't see it the hour before. And if you go past the 3 hours, you start to see the impact of Elizabeth's lie, how massive it is at reach, and how incredible the reaction to her single tweet of the story, which I think was more than like 7,000 retweets in the first 3 hours just to her message. And then when you look at the spread in the first 12 hours, you have again another completely different map that has completely changed the geography of how this message is spreading. So the next thing we did was to look at what kind of images were carried in these tweets. So image similarity analysis is something that allows you to compare different images so that you can start looking at images as if they were kind of like a conversation, and you can start mapping similar images together to see what types of images appeared. And the first thing that we noticed is that whereas in the first day mostly the images were about Aylan, towards the end of the first day and for the next 3 days, as Farida was saying before, images started to become about interpretation of the image of Aylan and impressions from artists that were showing their own take on the story, adding a political message to it, adding commentary to it. You can nicely see in green the images of Aylan and in blue the images that are variants on the original one that are cropping up in the next couple of days. And then you can start doing some concept tagging of the images. So we used deep machine learning to understand the content of an image regardless of the caption, because when you're kind of like mapping a global phenomenon, you never know what kind of like keywords people are using when expressing their comments on an image. So if you're really tracking how an image is spreading or how a set of images are spreading, you need to be able to analyze the image itself. So what this machine learning does is basically applying some tags to the content that we see coming through. And this is simply a breakdown of the subjects that you see in these pictures. Obviously, the main one being person with lots of pictures of refugees and Aylan himself. But then you start seeing how a huge cluster is images of a beach. And it's not just a beach where Aylan Kurdi was found, but it's also a beach as a signifier, like a context to what happened and expressing messages through, for example, riding on a beach, which is a quite interesting example of that. And then you see a cluster which is about sport, which might sound weird, but includes people showing support in stadiums at the football games on a Sunday, and then images of Aylan playing football. Or another big cluster was signs, people kind of like simply delivering a message off the back of this conversation on the story. And then the last thing you'd always obviously analyzing the topics that carry kind of like this conversation in terms of what's in the captions that people are associating with it. So you can see, for example, that in the first couple of days, the focus is on the story itself, and in the second, third, and fourth day, it starts to become about how the kind of like episode is extending the crisis in the Middle East and how the refugee crisis is impacting a much wider set of issues. Or you can spot more granular elements like, for example, the centrality of the role of the father to the narrative. You can see the father as one of the main topics here, and how it correlates to other topics in the story. And usually this shows you that that topic is central in the way the narrative is being developed. So, to cut a long story short, this is basically what happened. It started in Turkey with the Turkish press releasing these pictures on a website at around 8 a.m. It was picked up by Turkish Twitter slightly later in an hour, and by a journalist and activist that published the story on Twitter and kind of like started to expose it to the right people on Twitter. It then spread to the Middle East, especially in Lebanon and Syria, in the second hours, where you start seeing people engaging with the story and again exposing it to the relevant groups of people in those areas. And then it goes viral before the press has even started to pay attention to it and global in the fourth hours, and it's only after that that the official press gets involved. And it's the first article that the official press published on the story is the Daily Mail at 1:30 UK time, where basically the story is already viral, it's already global, but the press starts to take hold of it. And I think what was interesting about this story is that although, as you've seen, Twitter is dominating the timeline for how the story spreads in the first 12 hours, and one might assume that is this kind of like bottom-up movement that is actually driving how the story is spreading. What happened in reality was there was the journalists on the ground in the different countries that picked up the story, exposed it independently and verified it independently and exposed it to their own networks of journalists and people that were interested in the refugee crisis. And that connection between the right people, the right content at the right time made that story go viral and then got the press to pick it up later. But effectively was an unofficial kind of like take from the press that put the story on the map.
Okay, thank you. So Carlotta and Claire, which one of you is going to go next?
Do you want to go next from a UNHCR perspective? Okay, yes, thank you.
Okay, good evening. So yes, I bring UNHCR perspective. UNHCR is the agency of the United Nations that works to protect refugees and bring solution for them immediately in the emergencies and then even on the long run. Well, the Aylan Kurdi's image, maybe for the very first time, brought the effects of the war on the shores of Europe. I mean, before it was for the refugees and their stories, but that was much more powerful. And people in Europe got the impression that for the first time, maybe the, worst effect of the war were not anymore so far from, their living rooms, from their houses. And actually, the image of Aylan and then the stories of the refugees that were with Aylan, for the first time gave the demonstration that Europe could not anymore consider itself too far from any war, actually. It has been a kind of an illusion for the past few years to consider Europe kind of an island, very far and protected, and it is not the case. At UNHCR, we took the decision to do not spread or use the image of Aylan Kurdi because we thought basically that this would have been in a way against our mandate, that is the one of protecting refugees. And we thought that by spreading the image of Aylan, this would have in a way been against his dignity. But now comes the question, did the use of the image of Aylan in a way increase the level of protection for refugees, for those that survived to that journey or to their terrible lives in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria? Did the use of this image, yes, it brought we saw the change in the use of the terms, but the use of the image in a way helped in bringing more consideration for the refugee cause, or bring more respect to them, or increase their dignity. For me, it would be very interesting to understand if this change in terms of the use of terminology has continued. Because we struggled a lot as an agency with media in asking to them to use the right terms, because this is a crisis for refugees. It is not a crisis for Europe. It is a crisis for refugees. It is not a crisis for migrants, because when you have 60 million people in the world that are displaced, and you know that 86% of them are living in non-industrialized countries, we are speaking of a refugee crisis, not a migrant crisis, okay? But this didn't happen, actually, because we still struggle very much, not only with the media, but when we go analyze the policy documents, the agreements, the analysis, we still read and we still see that mainly we have the use of migrant. And there is a reason for that. It's not just kind of a negligence, okay? So my question, is, did the use of such a strong image really help in changing the policy? And also, did this image help in bringing more knowledge to the people in Europe about the Syria war? What is the story behind Aylan? How many people know about the story of Aylan Kurdi family? The story of Aylan Kurdi family is an iconic story because it represents the story of most of the Syrian refugees. A family that was completely disrupted by violence, by terror. The father already tried to cross into Europe by crossing the Evros River, was beaten and pushed back. So they tried this desperate journey as the very, very last resort for them. They tried to ask for asylum in Canada because the sister of the father of Aylan and she managed to get $27,000 to pay for the sponsorship, but for let's say bureaucratic aspect, they couldn't go to Canada because they were not defined as refugees in Turkey. They are like guests in Turkey, okay? And then they asked for resettlement, and they were given an appointment a year and a half after. So that was really for desperation, and this is the desperation of so many. And today we had another 9 people dying in the Aegean, again another child, again today. And also I was thinking about the difference with, if you remember, another iconic moment in this crisis. If you remember 2013, the shipwrecks in Lampedusa and Malta. You remember how Lampedusa still, became a name broadly known, and still Lampedusa is from Mexico to Korea, considered the symbol, the symbolic island of migrants and refugees. I remember last year we were saying in the office, everybody thinks about Lampedusa because many media calling us and say, what is happening in Lampedusa? And Lampedusa was very quiet, but still it is in the image. It's so much iconic. And actually, after that shipwrecks, the decision was taken, an historical decision was taken to start an operation to rescue lives at sea. And that brought to the rescue of hundreds of thousands of people. And it is something that really changed a bit the course of things because this operation have continued with, alternate way of managing it, but still it is something that now it's more difficult to go against, the principle of saving lives at sea, On the contrary, the people became very sympathetic with the Syrian cause, with the fact that the poor island had died, but the policy decision have not followed probably this empathy. And what we see now is that instead of, in a way, managing the so-called migrant crisis, on the policy aspect, what the politics in Europe is doing, it is undermining the very, very basis of the asylum right. That, asylum is a pillar of our humanity since centuries. Without the right to asylum, we would really feel more insecure and without any kind of protection against persecution and against violence. And now, what we see is that instead of responding positively to this desperate cry for protection, desperate plight for protection, we see so many people that have invested their money, but not only the money, the fare, all the hope, and the response now is very negative because they are rejected. So instead of protecting, we are rejecting. So sorry for being a bit not so optimistic, but I'm very convinced of the opposite, that we have to continue in finding the right way to create, to inspire and emotion people, because we really, this is the only way. I mean, we really think that it is a challenge, it is difficult, it will not be easy, but we still need to create empathy. It is the only way to probably also give the people the sense of the capacity to do something. Because now what is very bad, I think, is that people become very sympathetic and then they feel in a way passive, because they feel psychologically very, very hurted by this image. And but they feel that the politics is so, I mean, far from their feelings. So we need to continue to create empathy, but also to show people a way in which they can activate, they can do something, they can ask to the politics not to use in a very opportunistic way the fear of people. It's much easier to respond to fear or to use the fear of the European citizen instead of giving a concrete and positive response to the call for empathy and for the protection of those that are fleeing war. This is the situation how we see now. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire.
Good evening. So my day job is, I'm now the research director at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. But the reason I was involved with this project is because up until last April, I was the senior social media officer at UNHCR, so we were colleagues. So for me, I watched this unfold as somebody who thinks a lot about imagery and news, but also this for me was exactly, obviously something I'd been working on for the last few years. And as the senior social media officer at UNHCR, my job every day was to decide what images we were going to put out on Facebook and Twitter to get people to care, every single day. And every single day we would post lots of images of refugees, and we desperately tried to get people to care. And we did have a community of people who did care on Facebook, and they would send us messages, but we always felt we couldn't break through. And so we would sit and we would analyze which images worked, and we'd end up having conversations that were like, well, this week, that lovely picture of a child in a Syrian supermarket kissing another child, remember that one? That really worked. It's like kind of BuzzFeed-like conversations, but at UNHCR, because our job was to raise people's empathy. And so the day that the image emerged, I remember walking out of work and, like many of us, turned on my mobile phone and scrolled through Facebook. And for the first time ever, every single person in my feed, irrespective of whether they were a former colleague or they were a journalist or they were a friend or family, everybody was talking about this image. And for me, I was like, imagine if I'd been working. And it's fascinating to hear that UNHCR didn't make the decision to use the image, and that was absolutely the right call, and really you didn't need to because everybody else was. But the politics of that image and why it was shared so widely will be the subject of PhD dissertations for the next 50 years. And my area of knowledge is not about, you know, what was it about the image in particular, but I think going back to the empathy, and you, I think, will recognize this as well from your social feeds, everybody saying, I can't look at this image because that's my son or that's my daughter. And for the first time, they were able to see themselves in that image. I think it's really important to think about the graphic nature of that image. And BuzzFeed had that trigger warning. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about where this image sits when you compare it to other historical images. From the Vietnam War, we definitely had images that similarly have been quoted as saying this changed people's public opinion. But I think in this image here, you saw people on social media recognizing that they were their own editors. So half the people were saying, I will not share this image because I don't want you to see it. And half the people were saying, I absolutely am going to share this image because you need to see it. And normally that gatekeeping decision are made by editors in newsrooms. Now, because we all have the power to publish, you saw people themselves making that decision about whether or not to share that image. And ultimately, I think one of the most interesting elements of this were the memes, as Farida talked about. And there's something here about communication theory, which is the same as jokes. When Jon Stewart made a joke on The Daily Show about George W. Bush being stupid, the reason everybody laughs is because there's enough knowledge about George W. Bush potentially not being the cleverest president. The same here is that when you see the image of Aylan Kurdi on the bed, the illustration, it has a deeper connection because you have to know the original image and you're putting it in context yourself. So that in itself is really interesting. So I think one other thing that's important to note around the graphic imagery is the weekend before, was it a Monday that the image came out?
Wednesday.
A Wednesday, okay. But so the weekend before, some very graphic images of children washed up on a Libyan beach emerged, 3 children, and you could see the children facing the camera, their bodies were bloated, terrible pictures to look at. And in fact, somebody I follow on Facebook posted those images and said, everybody needs to see these. And people reported those images to Facebook and said, this is too graphic, and Facebook took it down. And there was an interesting conversation on Facebook about censorship. Who is it for Facebook to take these images down? And then 4 days later, we had the image of Aylan Kurdi. Because it wasn't graphic, because he looked like he was sleeping, that for me is why, if there had been any more graphic than that, it wouldn't have passed through. And those of us who worked at UNHCR doing social media, we were making calls every day about, can we show this? Is it too upsetting? And the truth is, people wanted to see happy refugees. Whenever we showed images that were distressing, our audiences would turn off. And I think there's something about this particular image of Aylan Kurdi that, yes, incredibly distressing, incredibly upsetting, yet he was sleeping and you couldn't see his eyes. And that's why people will write dissertations about it. But it's such a fascinating case study in terms of what people will share and not share. So, I mean, I'm going to throw a quick question to Craig about BuzzFeed's decision to put on that graphic warning on before you showed the image.
Yeah, I mean, so that was done by the main news team in the US, so I wasn't specifically involved in that, but we in our content management system, we have this so one thing I think about why we did it is that we have the tool to do it, and it's very easy, and nobody has to go to a developer to say, can we do something about this image, to create something. So anybody at BuzzFeed can very easily put what we call a click to reveal on an image. And the fact that, over time, before we had it, there were graphic images, and somewhere along the line, somebody went to our product team and said, could we have some kind of a click to reveal thing that might work for graphic images? Now, the other use case of that is actually for much more lighthearted stuff where it's almost a game getting somebody to click it to see it. So you have a dual use of it. And so one, having the tool enables people to think about the decision making in it, rather than being like, well, either we don't use the image or we do it, we actually have a third option. And so that helps. And so, basically just, a discussion happened among editors and people about the image and what their reaction was to it and what sort of the standard is about images that we'll put up. And the best decision was, they felt the best decision was to flag it and make it very clear it's a very graphic image, to use the click to reveal, and then people can make that decision for themselves rather than forcing it. But this goes to kind of, I don't know if it's a paradox, but at the core of this that you're all talking about is that on the one hand, it's a graphic image. I have 2 kids. It really affects me when I look at it, even to this day. But so on the one hand, they didn't put it out, your agency. But on the other, it needed an image like this to get at least some people to wake up. Not everyone has woken up. There's still a lot of, this is a big sort of challenge here. It's like you don't want to force graphic imagery on people, but to a certain extent, might be an argument that you need just the right amount of graphic imagery, right? So I'm wondering, for you and for you folks, is that what happened here? You talked about it being just graphic enough in a certain way?
But I think it's odd to talk about this, but it's not graphic in the sense. When we think about graphic imagery, I write quite a lot about graphic imagery. There was no blood. I mean, it wasn't. So I think actually the study is around empathy and how this image, we can say it's graphic because it's upsetting, but I think that's different to what's graphic. And I think the lesson here is what type of imagery does people have an emotional response to? Because it was the emotional response that made them share that. So I just think in terms of graphic imagery, we talk a lot about should news organizations have these warnings or not. Ultimately, I think it's a choice for people to see it, and actually often the description itself can be, somebody saying there's an image circulating of a 3-year-old boy on a beach who's died. you've got to be pretty heartless to not, even without seeing the image, know that this
Right.
is something that's quite powerful. But I think it's interesting to compare some of those really iconic images from the Vietnam War and to say, what was it about this that in many ways was less graphic but did more to change perceptions?
What did it evoke from those historical? You put some. There's some, going back to like religious imagery and other things like that. Like what were those connections from historical images and that one?
I think in terms of photojournalism, I think there's 2 points to be made. One is the way in which the media made these connections, right? So there was the Kevin Carter image that of the girl, I think it's somewhere in East Africa, the girl with the vulture. There was the girl running away from the napalm attack, Vietnam. So there were these big kind of photojournalistic images that it was being compared to, but I think to Carlotta's point about what did it actually do, I think there's a kind of sloppy historical reading of some of these big photojournalistic iconic images in terms of, and that really made a difference, right? So I think that there is something about the assumption that an image has made a difference and the actual, reality of what did it actually do, or is there a desire to give too much power to the image because something in the end did change? And I think Carlotta's point about, on the one hand, this kind of outpouring of empathy and so on, but what actually changed politically, and this is one of the things that we try to unpick in the report as well, is we sort of try to understand how are politicians making, the most of this image almost as a photo op. And this is what you see. You see this image popping up all over the place in the US presidential election, so very, very early on, when people, demonstrably kind of bring this image, a huge printout and sort of say, this is why we need to do something, or this is exactly why we need to build higher fences, right? So it's mobilized in these different ways. But I think if you look at the policy development, both in terms of, the UK and Germany, for example. So what happened in Germany, days later, Merkel opens the borders. But where are we now? We're in an absolute draconian situation where, it's almost like the Geneva Convention's been kind of thrown out of the window. And so, what is the long afterlife of this image? You can't necessarily say, this is what the image did, but I think where we are now in terms of geopolitical response to this crisis, it's pretty frightening how, Europe has turned its back on, century-long kind of hospitality, origins in terms of, what the political response is. If we look at the UK, what happened, and this is the response of, kind of to Claire's point, the media, is the Independent started a petition which generated within the space of 48 hours nearly 500,000 signatures to put pressure on David Cameron. So in terms of what did the image do politically, it absolutely galvanized, it absolutely did something. But what was the concession on the part of David Cameron? We'll take 20,000 over 5 years. It's really the kind of the smallest possible gesture in the face of, quite significant political pressure to do pretty much not very much, So if you look at, the distribution of across Europe in who has really taken on very, very large numbers of refugees, Germany, in a very unusual turn on the part of Merkel, has taken a lot. But if you look at the different ways in which different, particularly Nordic countries, are responding, the way in which the mobile phone is being mobilized, for example, against a refugee. So if you look at the response in Denmark, where people are being stripped of their possessions, it doesn't take you long to kind of go country by country to say, well, actually, on every single country level, the situation is worse. Right? So on the one hand, you have this kind of moment of possibility, but it's not followed through. And so I think in terms of, it's a question of how do you create empathy, but how does that then actually lead to behavioral change? And how does that then lead to political change? Does an image do that? No, I don't think it does. People do that. But what you see in the UK is that on the civic response side, people were, collecting toys and wanting to, drive van loads of gifts and so on to Calais, but they weren't fighting the immigration bill, right? So they wanted to do something on a deeply personal level, but they weren't willing to do the hard political work to basically fight through all of the boring channels to challenge the political kind of classes that were pushing through this absolutely draconian immigration bill. And so there's this tension. On the one hand, you have the civic response, which is, absolutely, incredibly important, but it doesn't necessarily connect up with substantive political challenges, I think.
Well, can I just very quickly talk about the news media, because I think there's something here around objectivity that actually, from a news media perspective, people were sharing this and saying, what can I do? And so an outlet like Mashable, they would say every time they shared any video or story about refugees, it would get huge traffic, and they started to put at the bottom, here's things that you can do. But it was all sending blankets to Calais. Nobody was saying, this is the MP you should write to. And that's because the news media says, well, we can't do that because that's an advocacy position, which then is interesting for other organizations to say, how do you get into a space where people want to do something and actually give them the tools to do it in a legislative way, as opposed to, they don't need more teddy bears, but people, they want to do something, but nobody's giving them the tools to know exactly what to do.
But I think if I can go back to the kind of like the sharing on social media element, I think we're almost taking too lightly the fact that someone decides to post those pictures online, because we're almost like looking at it as just another channel that people can use to kind of like deliver some kind of information, but actually it's an expression of identity. And the moment you decide that you express your own identity through that picture, you're kind of embodying that element and that message and that tragedy. And I think that's a massive success, I think, in terms of creating empathy. So even just the kind of like the lighter indicator, which is someone taking the picture and resharing it on their profile, I think is a great success, as in the fact that it kind of like generates that empathy that is simply not there before.
Can I be a little bit controversial? When we were at UNHCR, we would look at the difference between the numbers of retweets when people would retweet our stories versus who actually read them. And there's a badge of honor around, I'm the sort of person who shares a story about UNHCR. So I think that there's also the element of, on that day, if you didn't share that image or talk about that image, it felt like you weren't a very nice person.
But wait, so you're saying that people would share it, but they wouldn't actually read and go further? It would sort of, well, this is why people share things, is to present an image of themselves that they want others to see. So we'll take questions soon, but one thing I want to ask everyone here is, so in the context of journalists, a journalist at the Washington Post, Liz Sly, was a huge factor in helping this get wider attention. And her tweet was not an objective tweet. She said something like, she put the photo and she said, this is the face of our failure with the refugee crisis. And so that was an advocacy tweet, and it worked. And I'm wondering sort of, what are the lessons for journalists around this? If the goal is to make people care about this, like what should journalists be doing? Does anyone have any suggestions on that?
If I can quickly add on that, I mean, what I've seen in the data set is that the tweets were generating the highest amount of reactions and traction, where the tweets where people were free to express their personal opinion on the story. And so it was kind of a blessing that journalists independently picked up the story before they had to express a point of view on behalf of a newspaper, because they were able to give their own independent read on the story from their own local sources. And this is like something that has fueled the viral reaction in the first 3 hours. And that made a massive difference, like completely changed the tone of the discussion. And I think even having people then arguing publicly whether they should be publishing the picture or not, I think also eviscerated some of these issues at kind of like local level, to get the different kind of like communities to engage with the story in different ways. And I think also the local element, as in the geographic element in the way it's spread, it always kind of like surprises me how something that goes kind of like viral in a global way actually has roots that are very geographic and very local, and ties into networks that are very specific to specific towns and circles of people that know each other and that work with each other in real contexts, which we seem to forget when we're trying to see this kind of information and make it kind of like reach the right groups of people.
What do you want to see from journalists?
Well, for media, from our point of view, it would be important not to burn the interest in just a few days, because after the death of Aylan, probably another 100 or maybe even more than 150 children have died. But still, I mean, people are now not caring anymore. You know, almost every day you have somebody dying in the Mediterranean, and media are not reporting about that anymore. So yes, I mean, to media to maintain these interests, to engage with this. I know it's something that's go maybe against the interests, because you need to find new subjects, but it is a challenge. But to maintain the interest and to show and to explain why, I mean, this is continuing to happen. There is a reason because of that.
Can I add something to that? In terms of the Liz Sly tweet, the other thing that I think is really relevant to say here is that Liz had no idea that she had this impact, right? So when we contacted her and we showed her the visualization, this was the first time when she realized that she had been so crucial in the spread. So there's also something about journalists knowing that sometimes that is, you know, they're really, really crucial in the way in which, as Francesco explained in detail, in the ability for something to get picked up or not. And in this case, you know, she had no idea that she had been so central. So there's also something about when you do this kind of research, there is a value in showing people, well, there you are, and you know, your advocacy tweet, as someone who had been reporting from Cabana and who had been, you know, basically doing all of this work and who has the credibility and who speaks from a, you know, a position of authority, is in the right moment adding her voice. I think that is that kind of combination, but also then to be able to show that that was the impact that she had. And I was really surprised that she had no idea.
Did she say anything about being worried about having an opinion?
Not to
Yeah, because
us,
I think you're absolutely right. It's because she was from that region and she had reported on it. I think if it had been a 22-year-old intern at Central CNN news desk, there would have been a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
But I think it's a fascinating topic about you know, advocacy and what we said.
So let's please take some questions. There's one there in the back there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Aisha Mena. I work with Midan, and I'm interested in how we can, you know, what I'm interested in is there's a similar debate around the iconic imagery in the United States around Trayvon Martin's image after his death. And it seemed also that this image didn't have any impact or effect in terms of policy or law. But 2 years later, that image had a kind of viral effect many years later because people had conversations in private. The Black Lives Matter movement and that hashtag, actually, you can directly trace it to conversations around the Trayvon Martin image. And so what I'm interested in is, are there methodologies or are there ways that we can, you know, further this research so we can see the longitudinal effect of this image? That, you know, and what I'm concerned about is that focusing just on this kind of short-term impact, you know, it's the fact that we're talking about it seems like a really important legacy of this image. And I'm curious if there are ways we can think about more longitudinal effects around viral imagery you know, by maybe interviewing people, asking them how it's shifted their mindsets, and seeing if maybe there are seeds that are might not be like obvious right now, but I'm curious if there's any research being done on what those seeds are potentially planting and might be more apparent in a few more years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, again, in the report, we start to touch on this. So in the lab, we have 2 ethnographers, and of course, you know, they're extremely well placed to do this kind of work. So one is looking at how this image played a role for young people volunteering for the first time in the UK and in Norway, where the image had a really significant impact in the local elections in Oslo. And so what she is doing at the moment, she's doing her field work now, is precisely that, to try and understand what is the long-term impact of this image, in this case, in relation to young people, and the way in which they started volunteering for the first time on the back of that image, where they said, it is because of that image that I now want to, you know, work with local organizations. But I think in terms of the Trayvon Martin image, I mean, I teach social media analytics, and so this was one of the images that I talked about in my opening class when I tried to make the class really exciting for my students. So I decided to show them Beyoncé's Formation video and her intervention in the Super Bowl halftime show. And, you know, I mean, it's that kind of stuff where, you know, especially in Formation in the video, the Trayvon Martin kind of image is really, really potent, where you essentially have, you know, a young lad standing there with the cops effectively then, you know, kind of, you know, lowering their weapons And so the resonance, the deep cultural resonance of these images long term, and particularly Black Lives Matter movement, but also I think something similar is happening around the hashtag refugees welcome and all the different permutations of that. I think analytically and methodologically, these are really, really difficult things to study, but incredibly important. And I think, what we sort of started to touch on in the report is almost what are the skills that you need to bring to the table in order to do that, not just in the short term, but also then in the long term, and how do you track that? And so the work, for example, of someone like Ryan Milner in the US, who is writing now about mimetic media, and who's trying to kind of think about, how do you think about the way in which a lot of what we encounter in terms of, virality and so on, has this much longer life. And so he's come up with kind of, I can share some references, this idea of mimetic media, that a lot is now, has this kind of feel of a meme, but it's not exactly a meme. And so I think these images like, refugees welcome, some of them are coming out of meme generators and they're image macros, but quite a lot of them have that feel of a meme, but they're not exactly a meme. And I think so there's these new cultural forms that are drawing on those forms that we're, memes that we're more familiar with. And so I think this is incredibly, as you said, incredibly important to talk about and to do so longitudinally, but, with this kind of knowledge that this has to be done like across sector and in an interdisciplinary way, which makes it incredibly difficult.
I think the context of the study is also for this to be a rapid research response. So the objective here, obviously it would be amazing to have a more kind of understanding of the longitudinal impact of the study. But what we wanted to do here was to try to make the impact of the image in the short term tangible and fix it in time and say this thing happened, because there's so many viral phenomena happening every day, and there are so many kind of waves of kind of consciousness that touch different people at different times in different ways. What we wanted to try and do with this one is to just fix this one in time and see what has happened with this one specifically, and then maybe that could be the starting point for a more long-term study. But the objective here was, how can we deploy a rapid response to show immediately what the consequences were, because that's when people pay attention. If we had done this now, probably people wouldn't have cared about it as much as they did when we released this back in November.
Any other questions? Yes, one up here.
Hi. My name's Caroline Lees. I work for the European Journalism Observatory, which is based at the University of Oxford. We did some interesting research, but it was about legacy media across Europe, and we studied through the month of September across 8 countries, East and Western Europe, how they covered the refugee crisis. And obviously the Aylan Kurdi images fell smack in the middle of our research. And what we found, apart from there's a very clear differentiation between the way Western European media and Eastern European media covered the story, but the sort of headline was that at the beginning of the month, there was a certain level or a certain approach to how the media covered the refugee crisis. There was a huge spike in sympathy after the Aylan Kurdi images appeared, but by the end of the month of September, all the newspapers in Western Europe, and certainly in Eastern Europe, had reverted to their original position and in fact were more negative toward refugees than they had been even before the Aylan Kurdi images. And in fact, the spike lasted less than a week, more or less across all newspapers, and we did a representative cross-section of newspapers. So, you asked about how empathy lasted and what sort of changes it made. Certainly in the media, it was very short-lived. It was incredibly noticeable, but particularly noticeable for its transience. And I just wondered what the panel thought. Is this compassion fatigue on the part of the readers, or is it driven by the media? Were they bored of the story? Why did they suddenly change? In some instances, they turned on the family within 4 or 5 days. Is it the fault of the father? It was incredibly noticeable. And I wonder what you thought. Is it the readers? They don't want to read about it anymore? Or is it the media, the newspapers themselves?
Anybody want to start?
I think why this is such a fascinating case study is because previously, before an age of social media, we would have done that kind of research, and even historians would have said, the image didn't really have that much impact, because we would have studied legacy media and said that. So I think what's so fascinating is to cross-reference what was happening, and I think probably shouldn't say this at a journalism festival, but that role of journalists as gatekeepers and making a decision about this story. And was it, I think talking to journalists, even just informally, they were taken aback by the strength of feeling that they were witnessing on social media, and audiences who they didn't think really cared so much about that story, clearly really caring about that story. So I think, not to do more research, I'm a researcher, but I think that for me is what's so fascinating, what's the differences, and why was it that journalists said, no, we've had enough of this story now, or we're going to turn on the family, because that's a very classic, looking for the negative, as opposed to, we've got people here who really want to see, do something and behave in a different way. So it doesn't surprise me, but I think it's a really important thing to remember that by just looking at social media numbers, we have to put them in the context of the interplay between traditional and social media. Do you want to say something?
And also, I think the interplay in the sharing economy. So it's also, where are the journalists looking, or what are they drawing on? Because if you look at the kind of the civic societal response, I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening that's essentially drawing on the sharing economy model, which is really, really interesting. So the absolute explosion around the kind of Airbnb for refugees, Flüchtlinge Willkommen, which started in Germany, and then if you look at the offshoots of that across Europe, all, kind of coming out in October, I think it's also, it depends what you're measuring, it depends what you're looking at. And I think, like Claire was saying, I think people were really taken by surprise by the huge civic response. And of course, also if you think about, kind of legacy media, I mean, I did my PhD on the Palestine-Israel conflict. There's news when, bombs go off, and there's news when there's the signing of an accord, or there's news when Rabin is assassinated. But the actual reporting on the process, when there's kind of nothing to report, that's not what the media is good at. Process is nothing. A process is, it doesn't produce pictures. It's not, it's not interesting to write about. And so I think one issue here is that there's a lot happening that is essentially a process. And there's nothing to see, there's nothing to report, there's no, huge pictures or dramatic events. And of course, when there is then a dramatic event that can be linked to the refugee crisis, like Paris, like, Cologne, like Brussels, then there's huge media coverage. But, like what Carlotta is saying, in terms of, since Aylan, so many children died and nobody cares, it's because either there weren't, kind of iconic images, or there wasn't the right story. And that's, that's part and parcel of how the media works as an industry. So that doesn't surprise me at all either.
Right. It is also, but I think that in terms of traditional media, it's really a matter of choice. Because then it was Paris, then it was Cologne, and then it has been Brussels. But I haven't seen such an interest in, for example, engaging in a strong differentiation between the terrorism in Europe and the terrorism from which the refugees are escaping. Okay, and I mean, I haven't seen many outlets going deep into the refugee stories that are escaping ISIS or whatever, and that are now in Europe. So it is a matter of choice, basically. And even in Cologne, I mean, it was a huge mess. And then no interest in explaining that no refugees was involved, but just 3 North African people that have nothing to do with the refugees. So again, yes, it is a matter of choice. It is a matter of going a bit against the main, stream of things. Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
I would like to know if you could share your opinion about the action that Ai Weiwei did. If you would be so kind to share whatever opinion you have on that.
On his performance? I don't know. That he couldn't do the other post because it was too heavy to be picked up, so he had to lie on the beach. I find it terrible, like exploiting that. I don't know. I just hated it when I saw it. That was my.
Do you kind of follow the reaction on what
On
he
that
did?
specific one, now it was too late. it was outside the scope of what we tracked, but probably just because I was so involved in the study. I mean, I had some pretty dark times when I was researching this, and I was exposed for like hours and hours of images of different angles on Aylan. Because people talk about this story, and they mention one image, but there were actually like 28 images that this Turkish press agency shared. And so I was going through these images, and it was quite painful actually to go through all those different 28 images. And when I saw Ai Weiwei a few months later doing his trick, then I was kind of hurt personally, but like emotionally, by seeing that thing in place.
Because, before, because there was also in the time of the Berlinale, this action, also in the time when he did also his action in front of in Berlin with all the...
With the life jackets and the Reichstag.
There was a gathering, and celebrities and important people were wearing this, I don't know how they call them, this plastic, this aluminium ropes. Yeah.
There's been quite in the tech press and also in the, I don't know outside of the UK, but there has been a kind of, I would say, quite sinister mobilization of sort of refugee chic and photo shoots. And so Ai Weiwei, and I think it was Ai Weiwei and Anish Kapoor, who basically kind of donned themselves in these blankets, walking through, I think they did it in London, maybe they also did it in Berlin. An artist like Ai Weiwei is also a lot about the shock value, and is a lot about Ai Weiwei as a person who, has kind of a massive ego and, does a lot of very interesting stuff, but I think also does a lot of stuff that you kind of think it's very exploitative in the way in which, some of the disasters that he highlights and he moves on very quickly. I think, that there is enormous political value at times. I think this was very ill-judged, and I think there was a huge backlash. But I think it also shows this kind of ongoing engagement and desire to want to engage with this image, which I think that's what's really fascinating and really interesting about it. And similarly, the way in which Charlie Hebdo decided to use it, has sort of generated an enormous amount of sympathy in the aftermath, previous January for the attacks. And then a year later, they're kind of, business as usual and sort of behaving as they'd always done, and again kind of creating this like backlash. But I think what's interesting about the backlash to the Charlie Hebdo stuff is what they did is also interesting in the sense that, kind of going back to the points that Claire and Carlotta are making. On the one hand, this kind of like empathy and sort of middle class, kind of outpouring of grief and so on. But I think what they also did is, on the one hand, in September, you were all kind of crying about this dead child. And then, at the end of the year, everybody's like saying, oh, these are, kind of sexual predators. So it's also kind of showing the audience, what is it? And I think that's actually very powerful. And I think so in some ways there was, in my opinion, some misreading about, some of those responses, where I think what they were doing is also kind of through satire and maybe cutting it really, close to the bone. But they were also saying, there is a hypocrisy here, that on the one hand there's, this outpouring of sympathy, and then on the other hand, as soon as the tide turns, you turn on these people. Yeah. And so I think that's a very interesting, reading. And so what you had this massive Twitter storm around the Charlie Hebdo stuff, but I think a lot of it was, kind of hysterical and didn't really understand, I think quite sophisticated turn that they gave in the way that they reused that and mobilized it to kind of show Europe, oh no, you don't care anymore.
Well, I would add that in the meantime also really big numbers of people started to concretely activate it and went to Greece. Mm-hmm. It was very chaotic, but it has been really a wave of solidarity. So it is not only Greece, it's also throughout the Balkan route, but Greece is quite interesting as an example in the sense that I have the impression that really people who cares about this issue want to find a way, the fastest way to do something. Sometimes it is an individual action, and then they start to meet with other individuals, maybe very chaotic, But the problem here is that people are not trusting anymore the traditional way of represent their will and decision and their will to see, policy decisions, because it's clear that democratic tools are not working in as fast as people would like, and so there is this huge distance. It's a big issue, because when you read, analysis and investigations about the opinions, in Europe, and you read that 52% of people in Germany are still thinking that this crisis is totally manageable, and then you read in the Eurobarometer, you read that most of the people, like 79%, are thinking that Europe should find a way to manage and receive the refugees. And then you read that 87% of people are not perceiving themselves as Europeans. So there are so many contradictions in that. It really goes very much deep into the role of individuals and the means that they are given to be really active in this society, I think. Yeah.
So thank you to the panel. Thank you for your questions and your attention. We have copies up here. It's the introduction of the report. The report's also available online. You can search for it, search by the title. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.